Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. It is wonderful to have Alex talking about narcissism. I was visiting my friend Chase at his wedding, and we had during that time, I had the opportunity of having a long conversation with Alex. When Alex and Chase did meetups, Chase spoke more than Alex. So I did not have a chance to fully grasp what Alex is capable of. And and this is a topic that he has looked at. I mean, the thing I like about Alex's approach is that he operates in a very experiential way. He kind of looks deeply at his own experience and he's trying to come up with concepts based on that. So that's what we have here. So let's get started. So welcome, Alex.
Thanks, Shrikant. Glad to be here.
Excellent. So how about talking about, what got you interested in narcissism?
So it's interesting. I've seen a real huge kind of explosion in the cultural awareness about narcissism over the past year or so, I don't know if that's just because I became aware of it about a year ago. And then, when you notice something, you start to see it all around you. Oh, I have a gray car. They're everywhere. But I do think that because of kind of the virality of social media, that narcissism and kind of its effects on people and how narcissists operate, once people started to notice trends, like, oh, I know somebody that does this. Oh, I feel like I've been in contact or have a friend or a parent or a family member that has these traits. It just really started to resonate with people. And I think that that's why it became such a boom right now. So I experienced it the past few years, but I didn't know what it was because I didn't grow up with many narcissistic people in my life. But as I kind of migrated to new groups, I started to see people who were very unfamiliar to me in the way that they operated. And I really didn't have a framework that I had built over the course of my life to understand why these people acted the way that they did. And I started to see how much people that were close to them really were psychologically damaged by these people. And that is really what kind of drove me to get really interested. And my girlfriend and I have done a lot of looking into this. I've talked with my own therapist, other psychiatrists about this, and really tried to integrate it in with kind of what we talk about in this meetup group with philosophy and psychology. I think there's a lot of interesting kind of takeaways in that.
Wonderful. And folks, what we're going to do, the format is I'm going to have just a conversation with Alex about this topic. And we're going to cover a whole bunch of topics. As we put on the Meetup page, we're going to talk about what is narcissism, mechanism of creation of narcissism, types of narcissism, intergenerational nature of narcissism, and the innate desire people have to recreate childhood. We're going to talking about how it operates in the early childhood. We're going to talk about behavior of victims and codependents. We're going to talk about kind of sense of false reality that these people have. Fixed mindset versus growth mindset. We are going to look at the social implications of it using Trump and his supporters as an example. We're going to be looking at philosophy and narcissism. We're going to be looking at religion and narcissism. And we're going to be talking about social media and narcissism. It's a lot of things to cover. And what we're going to do is that I always do like to do a soft launch. So we're just going to have a conversation about it. And it will be about 45 minutes, 1 hour, something like that. That's what I estimate it to take, whatever time it takes. And then we're going to go into breakout rooms and small groups where we can discuss this amongst yourself. And then you come back with the best question that you have on narcissism. And we will have not only Alex answering this question, but other people can answer the question too. So consider this as an exploration of the idea of narcissism. And we are putting a whole bunch of things on the table here for you to consider. Then you discuss it amongst yourself, raise the questions that we have. if there is a pattern that emerges, for example, if people are really interested in narcissism in society and its social implications, we can do another meetup on it as well. So that's the plan for the meetup. All right, so let's get started. So what is narcissism?
So I think well, first of all, I just want to have a caveat that I'm not a therapist. I'm not licensed in any psychiatry, therapy, social work, anything like that. So just want to put that out.
Let me go ahead and do one more disclaimer. This
Sure.
is purely educational. This is not advice of any kind. You individual cases are very different from each other. You really need to talk to a kind of licensed professional if you want to do anything like that. This is educational. This is just exploring the idea. All right. So with that, back to you, Alex.
Great. Thanks. So I think it's important to distinguish between narcissism, the personality trait, and narcissistic personality disorder, which is the diagnosable personality disorder that has a number of criteria from the DSM, which psychiatrists use to diagnose. So narcissistic personality disorder, I'm going to refer to it as NPD, affects about 0.5% of the population, so 1 in 200. So it's a smaller number of people. But when we look at just society in general and look at traits of narcissism, that's much higher. Most of us have some element somewhere of a kind of disordered way of thinking in one aspect of life or another. Later on, I'll talk about an example that I can use for my own life. But it's basically, it comes, obviously, we know Narcissus from the Greek story. That's where the term comes from. But the current definition is much more broad than just being obsessed with yourself and with your own reflection, or both broad and more specific. But it's basically a psychological phenomenon where one believes oneself to be superior to others and deserving of special treatment. There's a lot of other characteristics, but I think that's a good place to start it. And it can be a personality trait, like I mentioned. So we could be on a spectrum of it. It's not a binary necessarily.
Okay. Can you repeat if you wanted to define narcissism? What is it?
I'd say it's a way of operating that in which you see yourself as more important or more worthy than everybody else, and you see yourself as a separate entity to everyone else, where everybody else is more or less, and we'll get more into this with the kind of creation of a false reality, but players in your game, in your scene, in your movie, they're just operators to you. And what matters is their effect on you and their relationship to you. And they're not kind of in a Kantian way, actors in and of themselves with their own goals and motivations who are of equal value to you.
Wonderful. Alex, I'm the advocate for the audience. They don't get to talk right now. So if I think that something is not clear, something needs to be re-emphasized, because these are kind of core concepts. So I will kind of ask clarificatory questions if needed.
Great.
All right. So how do people become narcissists? What is the mechanism of creation?
So it can be hard to separate genetic and environmental factors because they very often overlap. Somebody who has a genetic component that leads them to act a certain way in life, do you then attribute those environmental factors they create for their children as genetic or environment? It's hard to tell. But in general, there is not full consensus, but in general, most researchers think that it comes from a form of receiving conditional love from parents. This could be in the form of neglect or abuse or inconsistent parenting. And it could be, I'll give an example. A child is growing up and is held to a very unrealistic expectation. And when they don't meet that expectation, whether that's academic, emotional, any type of expectation that the parent puts on them, they do not receive love. it's conditional their um, on their performance or something that is other than just their own being, than their own core being. It also can come from uh, excessive praise in reinforcement of the attitude that that child is superior to others, that they deserve a spot in line ahead of others. Um, but I think in general, it's a combination of the two. And although they seem kind of antithetical, I think they actually are very often paired together, where when the child doesn't perform well, they're punished and not given love. And when they do, they're told that they're better than everyone else and really overpraised and over coddled. So it's a distorted uh, way of an upbringing in general that causes what it's called as a narcissistic injury, um, which happens when people are very young, and that is what spurs the creation of this false self, which they need to really get through life. They have to create a false self, a false reality in which they can operate and fit what they're expected to be.
So let's look at it because I think this is a huge point. I mean, this is a core point about psychology in general, that children pick up a lot of ways of being from their parents, and they pick them up at a stage where their conceptual faculty, their rational faculty, their independence of judgment is not developed yet. So it's kind of picked up very early through kind of emotional osmosis, emotional reactions to emotions at that level, at age of like 1, 2, 3, something like that, before they can fully kind of comprehend what's going on. So let's look at details. So suppose a parent is narcissist.
Mm-hmm.
What do they tend to do so that that gets transmitted?
Yeah, that's a good question. In general, a narcissistic parent is not um, it's a cycle, right? So they will often treat their children as extensions of themselves. So, like I mentioned, that there's other people operating in their universe. Their children are not an exception to that. But very often, parents who are narcissistic have a relationship to their parents or to their children that's very enmeshed, and they very much project their own feelings onto their children as extensions of themselves. So they don't see the child necessarily as the other that requires something different from them. They see them as a little version of them. So from what I've seen, let's say they have a feeling of self-hate that's really deep rooted. They will say that to their children as well because they don't understand the distinction there between beings, and they don't understand the emotionally uh, what they're doing to the child, kind of.
Thank you. Folks, we're going to cover a large ground. So please use pen and paper to keep track of the points that you want to bring up during the breakout rooms and points that you want to bring up in the questions when you have a chance to ask questions. We're trying to cover a large area, and we are kind of going through. And Alex is, actually making lots of observations in simple sentences. There is actually a lot of material there. So please keep track of your questions, as we'll be able to get to all of them. All right. So the next question is, so let's say a child grows up with a narcissist parent, kind of transmitting that idea. And what the intergenerational nature is, it like when the child grows up, they try to recreate the same similar kind of context in their interaction with others. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And I want to point out that there's very often narcissistic abuse of children will create one of two things: somebody who's also becomes narcissistic and exhibits a lot of the same traits as their parents, or somebody who has been trained to be the perfect codependent. So we can go into that But what was your question again?
Sure. So what happens to the children who grow up like that? So what you're saying is that either they become narcissist, or they become like victims or codependent. So
Mhm.
let's talk
Sure.
about the victims, codependents, and narcissist as.
Sure. So going back to the idea that narcissists don't see their children as other from themselves, they see them as extensions. The children who often become codependents learn that they need to emotionally show up and emotionally basically baby their own parents. So the relationship becomes blurred, and in a lot of ways, they end up parenting their own parents and helping them through their emotions, learning very carefully how to act so that they don't get attacked, so that they don't get abused. And they will be very conscious of their emotions and very cautious to walk on eggshells around them, and but also excuse the behavior and take on a sense of guilt and shame based around the abuse that's going on. So it's not just that they act like that, it's the psychological damage that occurs from having to emotionally show up for your parents at a young age. And what happens to them generally is that they very often, without kind of therapy or without really looking through their own upbringing and emotional traits, is that they seek out relationships that mirror those that they experience in childhood. So very often, one person who has a narcissistic parent who becomes a codependent will go through many more narcissistic relationships before probably even realizing that anything was wrong, because they will so deeply internalize all of the behavior towards them. They'll believe it's their fault that they're being treated this way. It, from what I've seen, they very often, the first, for me, for example, I'm not necessarily a prime target because I'm very quick to see somebody's actions as inappropriate and to kind of have a more theoretical line there. But somebody who was raised to be a codependent will immediately not see that as abusive. They'll think, wow, I must deserve that. I must be doing something wrong. So they'll continuously seek out friend groups, romantic partners who exhibit these same traits of basically dependence on uh, their partners. So, what narcissists are generally looking for is called narcissistic supply. And that is basically a, they want an endless source of that validation and praise, um, that to them, I think, represents the love that they didn't receive as a child. So they go through life. We're going to the other side now of the people who become narcissists. They grow up and consistently are looking for that, uh, like hole, try to fill the hole in themselves of the love they didn't receive with adoration and validation that they learned is equal to love. Um,
Okay, now what I'm going to do is that I'm going to put this in my own words. Now, my understanding of this is very poor, so I will speak it out. Please feel free to correct, elaborate, uh, you know, whatever you think is appropriate. So I'm looking at this child. Okay, so what it is that the parent basically has an emotion saying that I am good. So being a narcissist parent means that the person is saying that I am good, and it's a very strong emotion, and that is held in opposition to lots of data that is coming in from reality, which is actually telling that no, I mean, it's an unrealistic view of yourself, high kind of emotion about yourself. And that is actually protecting you from getting any kind of data from reality, from others. And it is kind of pushing away, evading all that it is. It's all, narcissism is all about holding that emotion in opposition to reason, in opposition to data that is coming in, up to facts. So you're trying to maintain a false sense of reality, of who you are. So that's what is going on with the parent. Now, as I understand it, what you parent kind of extends the umbrella of emotion to include the child. So the child, before it can actually deal with reality, figure out how to deal with reality, they get hooked onto this emotional umbrella, saying that I am good, we are really good family, these other people are not so good. But if they tell me something about, if I get some feedback from outside, I should ignore it because we are good. And so it's kind of by extension that idea. And then that, because holding that false view of themselves is so important to the parent, that the parent will push back very hard if the child gives any kind of emotion which is not adulation. So it is kind of trying to maintain a false emotion internally for the parent, and that same kind of mechanism of trying to hold an emotion about yourself opposite reality, that is getting transmitted. That's how I understand it. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
I think that's a really good way to look at it. And I think that's a really great point about the fundamental nature of a narcissist is constantly trying to find a way to reject all that data coming in and dismiss it and disqualify that, and to maintain that created false self at all costs. So it really is, it's a kind of a horrible being to constantly be in defense mode throughout your whole life. And I think an important point to point out is that narcissistic personality disorder, I think, really is, to me, when the person is, that false self is so strong that they are unable to really ever get past that. They're unable to view themselves as flawed, or to genuinely think of themselves as harming others, or as people who need to change. So it's a big issue. Yeah.
Wonderful. And I really feel bad about the children, because it's like that's happening to them at a time where their faculties are not fully developed. So,
Yeah.
and what happens is that we are, just like with the evolutionary base, our emotional mechanism develops first. You are born with it, with quite a bit of emotional mechanism. I mean, it too develops, but the core is already there. Whereas capacity to reason, capacity to figure out what is actually going on, get a sense of what a other person is, what their intentions are, what they're doing, all of that ability comes much, much later. And this emotional way of operating, once it gets instituted, then it's going to be harder. It's going to actually sabotage
Yeah.
any, I want to also contrast, I want to take a moment to contrast it to a valid opinion of yourself, because valid opinion of yourself is based on your ability to live. So you deal with reality and you keep getting feedback from it. You try to correct yourself at every level, and you get good at doing that. So now, when the opinion that you hold of yourself, which is based on that, is grounded in the experience of reality, and it is being continuously corrected by the feedback mechanism with reality, your interaction with reality, your interaction with others. So it is supported, and it is correctable and continuously evolving thing. It too is an emotional sum of how you feel about yourself, but that has a very different relation to reality and your life than this unrealistic. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And actually, if I can throw in my story here, I
Yes.
think that would be a good point. Um, so as I've worked on myself and gone through therapy and journaled and tried to open my mind and learn through meetup groups like this, through our podcast, through all different available ways in life, I've definitely noticed that in general, I have a fairly healthy integration of self and world that you were just talking about. But in one area of my life, I had I guess, a trait that was kind of bound in narcissism. And I'll just go through the kind of how that um, how that was created, I think, from my perspective, and how I was able to get through that. And again, this is talking about a narcissistic trait, not a full personality disorder. The fact that I have a well integrated kind of model of myself in the world for things other than this was what allowed me to notice this and then work on it. So that's really an important difference. So I'm a musician, and when I was growing up, I grew up in a really small town, um, and pretty quickly I had talent in it, and I quickly became like the best guitarist around. And so then, pretty early on, maybe middle school ish, I started to incorporate into my identity that, oh, I'm the best guitarist in around, right? And that was kind of how people knew me, and it became a core aspect of my being. So then when you that became somewhat of a fixed mindset where, oh, I'm the best, in this little bubble, and I want to avoid interactions that will disprove that or challenge that. So I would avoid trying to get lessons or play with people who were maybe of higher level than me that I kind of rejected. So it was kind of this dance around things that would tell me that I need to improve and that I'm not good enough, whatever that meant to me at the time was. So as I grew up, I mean, ironically, that's what makes you not grow, is rejecting that. So it was actually a huge hindrance to me actually becoming a better musician. Um, so eventually I kind of maintained that going up to college. And then in college, very much the first week, I realized, oh, I'm like one of the worst guitarists here. And it was pretty undeniable.
Mhm.
So, but instead, because I was still 18 and still very, I feel like, unaware of a lot of these traits within myself, I shifted that uh, kind of ego tie to my work and how good I was onto something else, onto music composition, where everyone was more or less new at that. So I could maintain that kind of illusion that, oh, I'm still the best, right? I'm going to be, right? I was able to defer that feeling to the future and think, oh, well, I will be, right? And there was no examples around me close enough to kind of challenge that. So then as I got farther through school and really didn't take advantage of a lot of the opportunities it had to offer, I discovered meditation, and kind of a bunch of stuff happened that really helped me kind of let go of those um, ego ego issues. And I was able to see, wow, I'm really self-sabotaging here. This is the same, that this trait has no reason to, I have no reason to think of this trait of mine differently than I do, in terms of my own just self-worth, right? Like I see myself as equal to every other human being by nature of, that's it, what I believe philosophically, that everybody's equal. So why am I having this little microcosm where I reject that and try to create this distortion? So I was able to, through therapy, work on that and overcome that, um, through, for example, small steps, almost like overcoming a phobia, right? So kind of exposure therapy, putting my work out into non-threatening environments to get feedback, and then slowly increasing that to things where feedback might be more direct and brutal, um, and learning to kind of be okay through all that. And once that cycle was broken, I was much I still have to keep it in mind, but it's much easier for me now to not feel a tie to my self-worth based on that element. And I think those are much more the stories that in general people have, where some, it's one point, some element of uh, some element of their life gets tied to their being, to their who they are and their value. And I think that's the kind of stuff that can help people, if I think, start to help this phenomena in general, but to at least work on it within themselves.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alex. One point that I got from this is the connection with the fixed mindset and growth mindset. At this meetup, we've studied Carol Dweck's book on fixed mindset and growth mindset. And I always thought fixed mindset is that people think that, okay, their abilities are too low and they are fixed. But what this is pointing to, this narcissism, is that you think very highly of yourself and you think you're fixed. So this is it's a variation, it's a kind of a fixed mindset where you say that the person who thinks that they have very low abilities and they can't grow, they're saying, I have low abilities and I have no capacity of growth. The person who is a narcissist is saying, I am perfect, so there is no reason to grow. I am already perfect, but it is a kind of fixed mindset. And everything that applies to fixed mindset versus growth mindset applies here, that you are actually growing. Like if it's a growth mindset, you're actually growing. Here, though your opinion is very high, if you look at it over time, nothing much will happen as a result of that, because you're explicitly saying that I don't need to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one point, a pretty important point about narcissism in terms of kind of recognizing it in the world that would be good to throw in here is not all narcissists appear that they're this classic grandiose thinking highly of themselves, right? Where they're up here, and those are the classic narcissists that people think of, people who are very clearly grandiose. They see themselves in a distorted way where they have heightened opinions about their power, influence, importance, and those have been more traditionally easier to point out. But one of the things is there's a whole nother kind of subgroup of narcissists that are called vulnerable narcissists or covert narcissists, depending on the way that they're broken down. But vulnerable narcissism is very much still a fixed mindset of being superior, but the justification for all this incoming data that says otherwise is that I am just, I mean, for lack of a better phrase, basically cursed by the world. I should have all this. I deserve all that, but the world is out to get me, right? So these are people who kind of are permanently in the victim mentality without having something necessarily to make that warranted. This is very common nowadays too, and often the abuse that comes with it, I think, is more difficult to spot because they're very perfectly crafted traps for people who are highly empathetic, because they come off as in need of help, in need of aid, and they draw in and kind of prey on these codependents who are looking for somebody to help. People who their core of their being is they feel like they have to be helping somebody, so they use this kind of massive exacerbation of their victimhood and sorrow to reel these empathetic people in and to keep them close, to constantly give them supply, the emotional validation, that thing that they lacked as a kid. And unfortunately, those relationships become super damaging for the codependents because there is no point at which the narcissist will be satisfied, right? There is no end goal where, oh, they're good now, I gave them it. So the empath, somebody who's highly empathetic, will just stay and continue to give and give and give as they deteriorate, because core to their being, growing up very often, as we said, with a narcissistic parent, is that they don't know the boundaries of when to stand up for themselves and when to stop giving to somebody else. So it very much is a kind of leeching scenario till the person is run out and very damaged, and then the narcissist will discard them and find somebody else. So for them, it's like they never existed. They just move on to the next person who can give them that supply.
Wow. You talked implicitly about types of narcissists. So what are the various types of narcissists?
So I think clinically it's broken only down into, and if somebody knows, correct me if I'm wrong, but grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism. Um, so those are the two we just talked about. But there's also further subcategories that I think can be very helpful, which would be, let's see if I get them all. Grandiose, covert, which would be the same as vulnerable, um, communal, which is, and again, these are very often overlapping. These are rarely just one on their own. Communal is when they create a very exaggerated community impact, where they're the person who gets their praise and validation by doing good deeds in the community. So let's say it's charity work, things like that. So on the surface, they're the perfect community member. They're at the leaders in churches, the leaders at the school, um, whatever. They're the people in the community who take charge and people look up to as, wow, they're great. And then so they get the praise through that. But at home, that's where the abuse happens, and it's very difficult for people, for children especially, who are, or anybody, a spouse, a partner, children of these people, because they are able to get away with it because people see them in such a positive light that it's really hard to imagine them being abusive at home or neglectful to their kids. Like, what do you mean? They're like the best community member. They do all this charity stuff. So it's a great defense. Um, there's the malignant narcissist, which is the most dangerous. They're much more close to the kind of psychopathic territory where, um, they and they really do enjoy more the harm causing aspects of it, and are the most emotionally, potentially physically, sexually abusive. Um, in general, the way I perceive that is they're very bad, right? They're very dangerous, very damaging people to be around. There's a benign narcissist who, um, doesn't necessarily cause a lot of harm, but they're just unable to change, and they can't see other people as, knowing something more than them or being better than them. They just are in this fixed mindset of being the best, but they don't necessarily cause a lot of harm to society.
All right. So now let's get to, let's see how we're doing on time. I think we're doing a good job of covering the basic concepts.
Mhm.
And so we'll hit one last big topic, and then we're going to go ahead and go to breakout rooms. And folks, what we want to do is we want to have you ask the questions, but what we found the best way to do that is that instead of just doing Q&A, taking questions one by one, it's when you do that one by one, it's kind of, it's luck of the draw, which questions come up. So instead of that, we're going to take all the questions that you have, and we're going to organize them, structure them, and then we're going to go through all of them. So the aim of doing the breakout rooms immediately after this is for you to, and what we'll do in the breakout rooms is that each person will have 1 to 2 minutes to talk about what questions that they have, what observations that they have, and then you have a general discussion. The end of which you come back with the questions. Each of the breakout rooms will have a facilitator who will make sure that the basic rules are followed, that everybody gets to talk, everybody keeps on topic, everybody's brief, everybody's courteous. That's it. All right. And so let's hit that one last topic, which is a really fascinating topic, and that is the role of narcissism in society. And this is the reason actually I ended up doing the meetup, because before I talked to Alex, I did not know how big this issue was. I said, narcissism is just one of the disorders that people have. It's one of the disorders. So of course, it needs to be dealt with. And that's how I thought of it. But after talking to Alex, we were talking about the places where you really see it. And the biggest example we talked about was Trump. Not just Trump, but the reaction of people to Trump. Not just the fact that, he's a very clear example of being a narcissist, but how people reacted to that. And it was really fascinating. That's when I realized that it's a very large issue. This idea of somebody trying to hold a false idea of themselves in contradiction to reality, facts of reality, is a very big issue in society. So where do you see, what do you see as a role of narcissism in society?
So there's definitely a lot to talk about in this area, and I think the reason that I don't see as much discussion about it is because very often the discussions about narcissism are geared towards kind of a clinical setting, right? Where you're helping people who have been through narcissistic abuse. You have a narcissist in practice, so you're trying to get them to have some behavioral modifications to cause less harm. So it very often, I think, is directed towards somebody who's trying to heal or get through this and understand the structure of what happened to them. So I don't think there's as much extrapolation to society because it's not as immediately important to people who need help, I think. But saying that, the whole Trump phenomenon, and I think this was a really interesting point that you brought up that made me think a lot. It's when we're talking about people wanting to recreate elements of their childhood, right? An element very often is that, and a lot of, again, let me pull that back. A lot of people have narcissistic traits that aren't, clinical narcissists. I think a lot of people grew up with kind of an authority figure, whether that was somebody in their family, maybe their father, who very much had kind of I'm in charge, this is what I say goes, and that's just because I'm your father, right? That's all you need to know. And I think Trump really is good at kind of playing on what people are searching for to validate their own self-worth in opposition to, like you were saying, the data coming in. So to have somebody that makes you feel good by saying, you're not the problem, it's everybody else, it's all the people coming into this country, it's you don't actually need to change, you're perfect the way you are, and so is your family. It's very validating to a sense of superiority, and it's basically saying you don't need to change, you don't need to improve. It's really the world that is coming to get us. In that shared kind of emphasizing that sense of we're all victims to all these other people, and we're actually better than them, and it was better back before all these people. It's I think really plays on some of those innate tendencies, those negative traits within people to want to choose the easy path, kind of, which is not changing, which is not understanding your own faults and your own things that you need to work on, but in offloading that to a scapegoat group. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and the scapegoating I can see very clearly because I'm in the field of immigration, and I mean the essential message. Okay, there's several levels here. So when you look at what Trump was saying to his supporters, what they're saying is that you're perfect. America was great, and you are great. It's these immigrants, it's these people all over the world with doing that we are doing global trade with, which is messing you up. You are perfect. It is the fact that all these tech companies are, screwing with your jobs. You're perfect. Now, that is the message of trying to, and it's false. So it's like, it is actually not the cause, but it is a way of showing that you're perfect. And then there is the point that you made about victimhood. Like they look at Trump and say, look how he's being treated unfairly by all the news media. He looks at them and say, look how unfairly all these immigrants and all these foreigners in other countries and all these tech people are treating you. And it's a way of kind of maintaining that false kind of emotional self-worth that I see. And I mean, the scale of it is quite scary. So that, that's what I thought. And I'm sure there is a lot of other implications for it. This is not just about that. I'm sure it applies to the way in which things work in academia, for example, because the one connection I see here is that this is like primacy of consciousness. So what is in my consciousness is primary. It is against primacy of existence, primacy of reality. They say what my consciousness holds, and that's a very deep idea in philosophy. This is like Platonic idea. I'll say it's all about saying this group, our group, whether it is the academics or the Trump supporters, are the good guys. All these other people, everything else, there is something wrong, and you're trying to protect the group. So I think the scapegoating goes with this way of thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. And it also applies on a small scale of the family unit with narcissism. There are very often roles. Let's just talk about having a narcissistic parents, for example, parent or parents. The children, if there's multiple siblings, very often fall into different roles. Golden child, scapegoat, invisible child. So this manifests even at a small scale. So it's the same thing, I think, just brought into a large scale, basically. And like you said, I don't think it's necessarily something, I don't think it's something just with one political party or anything. It's a trait within all of us that can be played upon by people who are good at manipulating it. So that's been used by political leaders, probably some of the most quote unquote successful political leaders of all time, because that is such a appealing message for anybody.
No, absolutely. And it has nothing to do with this one political party. I think there is stuff on this happens everywhere. And this is kind of a core, and that's the value of it. Now, I want to say one thing here. Again, I want to put a disclaimer. Okay, we are just exploring this. Okay, we are just trying to figure out what these issues are. And we have put things on the table. There are people here who actually may know a lot more about narcissism than we do. And we welcome, so several things. One is that when we go to the breakout rooms and when we come back, when you go to the breakout rooms, you'll get to talk about everything that we have put on the table. You can try to keep your comments brief. Also remember that feel free to disagree with anything anybody says. Speak your mind, just be courteous. That's it, that's the rule, okay? And when you come back, feel free to raise any questions that you want. If you think that what we have said is wrong, feel free to say that, okay? And bring all your questions, and then I'm going to just simply organize the questions, and we're going to go through them one by one, and everybody gets to answer the question. So if we raise a question, you'll be able to answer it too. Just keep your answers brief so we can go through all the questions and what everybody has to say. All right. So is there anything final you would like to say, Alex, before we go to the breakout room?
I think so. There's obviously a huge amount that we're able to cover with this, right? Like there's plenty of break-off discussions that would come from this. But yeah, I think the goal I really had was to cover narcissism as a topic and not focus too much just on narcissistic abuse or any one aspect of it, and kind of give people a overview that they can jump off from.
Wonderful. And the other recommendation I have, please do not bring your own personal examples and stuff. It's we don't have time and we don't have ability of going through kind of personal situations. So try to keep the discussion at a high level. I'm going to start the breakout rooms now. Each breakout room has a facilitator with star in their names, and they will be facilitating to make sure that everybody gets to talk. And I will see you back here in 20 minutes. Please bring back the best question you have on narcissism. All right. Everybody's back. All right, folks. So welcome back. Welcome back, everybody. Now we are going to the lightning round of questions. So what we're going to do is please go ahead and put your question on the table. Go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom in order to put your question on the table. I'm going to collect all the questions and I'm going to raise them one by one. I'm going to organize them and I'm going to raise them one by one. And then everybody gets to answer it. And then Alex also gets to answer it. All right. So there are many people on this call who know actually quite a bit about narcissism, may have different views. We have 4 rules which we have used for the past 5 years, which work beautifully. Number 1, type exclamation mark in order to speak or raise your hand in Zoom. Number 2, keep on topic. We're talking about narcissism today. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, be courteous. Feel free to speak your mind, disagree with anybody on anything, but please be courteous. All right, so it's going to be James, Sean, Charlie, Margarita, and Marjorie. James, go ahead. What's your question?
My question would be, how can we reduce the influence in our society to be so attracted to narcissistic leaders like Trump? I think the problem is not just Trump's there, but Trumpism and this kind of attraction to people like him who claim to be wiser than anyone else. I think I would like to know, how can we change our attitude in a society so that we no longer have an appeal for a person who has such narcissistic qualities as he does?
Wonderful. So how do we reduce the attraction that people have towards narcissist personalities? Next up is going to be Sean. Sean, what's your question?
Hey, I would just love to hear more about the intergenerational nature of narcissism and what that mechanism might be. And
wonderful.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. How does intergenerational nature of narcissism work? Very good. Next up, let's see here. Give me a second. Okay, it's going to be Charlie, Margarita, and Marjorie next. Charlie.
Yeah, hi. I want to focus in on the issue of a lack of community. Okay, if you have a well-grounded sense of community, people are going to be able to be aware that somebody is behaving in an antisocial way, and so the question is, what are the reasons why we have lost our sense of community? Okay. And I posit that the main reason is because of this acceptance of nihilism that has been foisted upon a society by the mechanistic materialist view of science, which has basically taken over academia.
No answers. Let's put questions. We'll do the questions and we'll get to everybody will get to answer it.
All right.
Okay, so
anyway.
Why have we lost community? And I have to connect it, Charlie, to narcissism. Why have we lost a sense of community, and what role has it played in the operation of narcissism in today's
Yeah, basically, if you have a sense of community, you have a sense of,
Thank you. Next up is going to be Charlie. Sorry to cut you off, but what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to capture the questions, just the questions at this stage. We'll have.
I understand, no problem, no problem. Yeah,
Thank you. Margarita, Marjorie, David, and Mike. Margarita, what's your question?
I think it's in line with Charlie's, because if this is really a negative trait or negative personality, why still persist in evolutionary perspective? What function it serves that's still here up to now? Maybe the community needs narcissists. Yeah,
okay, well, wonderful question. Why does it persist if it is negative? Excellent question. Let's see. Dr. Sheila, you had a question. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think I only had an answer.
Oh, you only had an answer. Okay, answers later on. First questions.
Later.
Questions are far more important. So let's get all the questions on the table first. Thank you. Next up is going to be Marjorie, David, and Mike. Marjorie.
So my question is whether we think social media has encouraged narcissism, especially amongst maybe, well, I'll just leave it at that, encourage narcissism. And if so, what can we do about it?
Wonderful. Does social media encourage narcissism, and what do we do about it? Very good. Okay, next up is going to be David, followed by Mike. David.
Yeah, Shrikant, there are a couple of good questions. I'll summarize similar to not right at Chase. One is the difference between narcissism and, for example, self-esteem, or when is it, positive characteristic to have, or how does one differentiate between the drive and the focus and the being resilient versus narcissism? Another question that came up was, are narcissists self-aware, or can they be changed? Can they be approached? Do they want to change to how to address it? And the third question related to all this with politics is that, why are we so focused on one political side as narcissistic when leaders from all over have narcissistic characteristics?
Absolutely. I completely agree. I realized that I had made a mistake. There is, the ideas of cancel culture, etc. On the other side also have the same kind of, same kind of stuff. So it's absolutely on both sides. Absolutely. How do people who are narcissists cure themselves? Okay, and I really like the question about narcissism versus self-esteem. Next up is Mike, followed by Shane Murray. Mike.
Is the need to consistently be a big fish in a small pond a sign of narcissism?
Wonderful. Big fish in a small pond. All right, that's wonderful. These are all fantastic questions. I think we're going to have such a great discussion. Next up is Shane Murray.
Yes, hi. How do we recognize our own narcissistic tendencies, even if they be minor? It seems that that's the relevance here, is that we recognize these things within ourselves. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right, folks, this is such a, and Rupali had a question. It was fascinating to learn about how narcissism develops in childhood. What is the relationship between narcissism versus egoism? So that's very similar to the question of, self-esteem. So self-esteem or proper egoism. Okay. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by Jeff. Mike, question only, please.
Question only. A couple sentences though to set the context. There's something called Munchausen syndrome, and when I go read a book, I can say, yeah, I can do that. So I can be a sociopath. I can be a narcissist. Or I can be a schizophrenic. I can even read another book and find out I got smallpox and polio.
Okay, what's the
So,
question, Mike?
what are the differential diagnosis issues that tell you whether it rises to the level of being clinical and that the person needs a lobotomy,
Please question.
or that what?
Please, I need a question.
Differential diagnosis, the key word for the syndrome. And is it safe for me to go out? Or is it safe for Rachel Maddow to go out, or does she have Trump derangement syndrome?
Okay, thank you. Next up is going to be Jeff, Jyoti, and Madeline. Jeff.
So our group did this a little bit, and I'd like to take it one step further and just relate narcissism, codependency, and healthy self-esteem to conscious interiority, and kind of the self-healing nature of conscious interiority, and what is the conversation that we might have with ourselves that can increase our self-esteem and help us actually work through, our own tendencies towards narcissism or codependence, as well as help us to be more skillful in relating to others.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. A really, really great question. It's connecting Julian Chain's work to this. Next up is going to be Jyoti, followed by Madeline. Jyoti.
Yeah. I think I'll skip. There is a problem here.
Yes. Jyoti, if you want, you can type in your question. That doesn't create an echo. Next up is Madeline.
Yes, there's something called Munchausen's by proxy, which is the parent who is convinced that their child is ill and takes them to one doctor after another, insisting. I'm wondering if that's a way of diagnosing a narcissistic adult.
Okay. Munchausen. All right. Okay. Now this is so amazing. This is just great set of questions. All right, Alex, this is going to be so much fun. So let me see what's the right place to begin. You know what? Let's start with distinguishing between narcissism and self-esteem. Having a good opinion of yourself, which is based on reality, is very good, and it's necessary. So the question is, how do you distinguish? What is the distinction between narcissism and self-esteem, which is based on the correct evaluation of reality, which is based on your feedback from reality? Very good. So that's the question. I'm going to put Jyoti's question also in the line. But if you would like to answer the question, what is the distinction between narcissism and valid self-esteem? What would you say? Go ahead and type exclamation mark or raise your hand in Zoom in order to answer the question. Everybody is welcome to answer questions. And then we will have, so we're going to start with, it's going to be Sheila, David, Mary, and Charlie. Sheila. Sheila, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay. I'd like to make a distinction between Joan of Arc and Trump. I think it's the old, you know it when you see it, there's a sense of the suffering that is brought on by the individual that marks the trait. It's very difficult because I think this is why I've looked at comments where people are thinking, let's leave politics out of it, because surely there are people that are so worshipful of Trump that it would be wrong-headed to assume there's any pathology for them. And from their perspective, he's a voice that they don't have, that they're muted in life, and that he is their voice. And so the pathology that we feel on the receiving end is not felt by them at all. And that's a wacky truth that I hate to say, but I think Ego strength is a fascinating thing, and it's deep and weird and great. But ultimately, we're stuck with trying to, thinking people everywhere are stuck with trying to bridge the gap between the people who feel muted and the rest of us who think we've got something to say. And this is, it's a very strange bridge to build between Joan of Arc and Trump, but there you have it. There is a whole bunch of ego involved, and as a society, we need to address every bit of it. We can't just toss it out as irrelevant. It's totally relevant, and it is political. And I don't think we get to turn our back on politics when it gets disgusting. I think that we just have to face it as we have to face pathology.
Thank you. Thank you, Sheila. Next up, so the question, David is next. David, the question is, what is the distinction between narcissism and self-esteem?
Well, I wanted to distinguish between narcissism and self-esteem in the sense that narcissism is not solely about, I mean, from my understanding not just grandiose or covert, these other forms, but in terms, not just about this superiority or having a single mindedness or a focus, but it also has to do a lot with empathy and the lack of ability to empathize with other people. And as we were discussing during the presentation about this enmeshment, and people and not the narcissist not able to distinguish the other people, the other objects in his or her life as having their own emotions, their own feelings, their own focus. And so it's where I see the difference in self-esteem and or egoism or focus is not that it's about this ability to push through and have perseverance and have a healthy sense of one's own abilities and accomplishments, but about the ability to not distinguish oneself from others, not able to empathize with others, the other people's problems and pains, and accepting the other person's reality as separate from the narcissist.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Great point. Next up is Mary, Charlie, Marjorie, and Alex. Mary.
So I think it seems like the distinction between narcissism and self-esteem is the amount of time the person spends in the mental space of either uplifting or correcting their low self-esteem. And so, for example, if it were just self-esteem, we may take the appreciation for ourselves for a moment and then quickly turn to empathize and look again at other people, compared to a narcissist who may just stay in that and then argue themselves out of the high self-esteem and then just, spend varying amount of times in that mental space.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Next up is Charlie, Marjorie, and Alex. Charlie.
Yeah, I want to focus some attention on the use of language, okay? And basically when you say, what's the difference between a narcissist and a person with healthy self-esteem? I like the way you described it, Shrikant, as being reality-based. But the thing is that relationships involve two people, and how somebody interprets or uses that word narcissist is going to depend upon who's using it, okay? So if a person has grown up in an environment where they were constantly shamed in school, for instance, okay, of not measuring up, not making the grade, they're going to see somebody who was very good at school as being a narcissist because they're showing off. And all they're doing is, if you take someone like Itzhak Perlman, who's a world-class violinist, not many people would say he's a narcissist because he plays the violin so well. But people will definitely say that if somebody talks about academic stuff and make somebody feel, remember the shame that they had while they're going through school, very often they will say, oh, well, you're just a show off and smarty pants and da-da-da. And so it depends. It's a relationship thing, okay? It depends upon the psychology of the perceiver as well as the perceived.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie. Next up is Marjorie, Jeff, and Alex. Marjorie.
Yeah, as a clinical social worker, my understanding also is that people with healthy self-esteem, and you have to remember this is all on a continuum, but they will, interact with people to connect. They want to make some kind of emotional connection. Whereas the true quote unquote narcissistic personality disordered person will interact with someone and they see it as a transaction. What can they get from it? So the person, it's not to connect emotionally, and that's where I think the empathy comes in. And also, when a healthy self-esteem person can look at themselves and say, I'm really have these abilities, I'm good in some things, yet I'm aware of my own limitations, so that if they receive criticism, they can evaluate the criticism and say, maybe they're right and maybe they're not right. Whereas a true narcissist really has a very fragile sense of self, and that they have to cover that fragility. Either they're aware of that covering it up, or they're not conscious of covering it up, but it's a defense against, with that whole grandiosity and the braggadocio. And that if you criticize a narcissist, it's met with rage. And the rage is to stop that sense of being totally unworthy from, coming into consciousness.
Wonderful. Thank you. Great observations. Thank you. Next up is going to be Jeff, Katie, and Alex. Alex, I'm going to have you go last, okay, all the time. Jeff.
So I would offer that the superiority side of narcissism and the inferiority side of codependency are basically two sides of the I'm not good enough insecure coin. They're basically, they are both, maybe a response to trauma growing up or whatever it might be, and that the self-esteem coin has, the sides to it. The healthy self-esteem coin has the side to it of, I'm worthy, I'm capable, I can learn. I'll make mistakes, but that's okay. I'll figure it out. I'll get feedback, and I'll have a relationship with other folks that will be interdependent and independent because I'm good enough. And so I think that that's possibly a way to begin to consider what is conversation inside. What are these things, and how do we get from the I'm not good enough to we're all good enough coin.
Wonderful.
Just a reflection.
Thank you, Jeff. Next up is Katie, Mike, and Alex. Katie.
Say things along the line of Marjorie, that people are extensions. That maybe you're telling a story and someone goes, oh, that reminds me of, and they're bringing it back to themselves. It's always like whatever you're saying, it's coming back to themselves. And to kind of bring some balance into political discussion, that's why Biden got hammered for when the soldiers died. And he said, that reminds me of my son when he died in Iraq. And he didn't give a lot of attention and interest into their story. So that was kind of a little bit of a narcissistic gaffe, if to add some balance into it. But I don't care whether he is or isn't a narcissist. That's not my point.
Thank you, Katie. Next up is going to be Mike. Mike, 60 seconds, please.
Okay, I used 15 of them trying to find the mute points, so I'll be brief. There is in the back of the DSM-5 manual a list of a set of flowcharts, 11 pages worth on each of the different variants. And if you answer those, in the hands of a skilled professional, they can tell what kind of sociopath or narcissist you are, and whether you should be allowed to go out in public or you should be Baker acted or worse. So there are some older things that are more scholarly, but I don't think they've been updated since the 80s. So I again yield the balance of my time.
Thank you. You finished 2 seconds early. Amazing. Thank you. Next up is going to be Alex.
I think everybody had really good points on this. I would say just I think self-esteem has potentially nothing to do with comparisons to others. And in some ways, it's really diametrically opposed to narcissism because it's a profound lack of true belief in your own importance or your own value. And then also self-esteem just, I feel like, is healthy and lifts up those around you and yourself, and narcissism doesn't, right? That's just a simple kind of way to think about it. And also narcissists will tear down everybody else's buildings to make theirs the tallest, right? Somebody with healthy self-esteem doesn't see that as a win. That was just hurting other people. Yeah, I just build mine taller, right? It's we all do our own thing, and if mine's the tallest, great. If not, I still am worthy, right?
Wonderful, thank you. I mean, the way I see it is that it's a distinction between primacy of consciousness and primacy of existence. Primacy of consciousness is focused on saying, okay, I'm good because I'm good because I'm good, ignoring everything. And the critical difference is that of feedback loop. So somebody with a good self-esteem is primacy of existence and massive feedback loop, continuously updating and just accepting. There is a sense of acceptance of reality, acceptance of who you are, and living with that as a base. All right, so the next question, I'm going to keep the general questions first, then we'll go to the particular questions. Next question is, how do you recognize tendencies of narcissism within yourself? Because again, it's very easy to say, oh, those people are narcissists. It is very hard to ask the question, how do you notice kind of narcissist tendencies within yourself? So any thoughts about that? Go ahead and type an exclamation mark. Shane Marie, if you want to answer the last question, you're welcome to do that in terms of the distinction between healthy self-esteem and narcissism. Go ahead. Shane Marie.
Yep, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought on that one.
No problem.
Yeah, sorry. On to the next person.
All right. So anybody wants to comment about this one? Otherwise, Alex, what do you think?
Sorry, just remind me one more time.
The question is, how do you notice the narcissist tendencies within yourself?
So my story was kind of about that for me. I suppose it's very helpful to have a therapist where they basically can act as a mirror to you and help to reflect what you're saying back to you, and then to see you that it really helps to understand, wait, that doesn't make sense. It helps to point out the kind of inconsistencies and distortions in your own thought patterns. So I would say talking to other people, especially people who are qualified to help you get to that point, is super helpful.
Wonderful, thank you. Next up is going to be Rojin, Jyoti, Helena, and Kyle. Rojin.
In my people watching experience, the more authority you have over other people and influence, the more you need to look at whether your actions are increasingly narcissistic. I think our system creates narcissistic politicians. Having watched a husband do that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rojin. Next up is Jyoti, Helena, Kyle, and Mike. Jyoti.
Yeah, I think now it's better. There's no echo. People who find themselves praising a lot about themselves or interrupt other people to better their statements or narrative to suit theirs. And they're a little bit on the selfish side. If they find themselves a little bit on the selfish side, then these are the markers one should watch out for to see if they are narcissistic in nature.
Thank you. Next up is Helena, Kyle, and Mike. Helena.
Hi. So I think narcissist tendencies. So you build up, like it was mentioned, a tower without considering others, and I think that if you are to consider other feelings, ask others how they feel about, and be cooperative. To build a relation and a connection. So I think someone's already mentioned that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Next up is Kyle, followed by Mike. Kyle.
Yeah, I think as like sort of per Alex's story, another really good thing that could be like a little like beacon of where traits of narcissism might live within us are the things that we've allowed ourselves to identify with. Whether you've identified as an expert in a field, whether you've identified as a member of a political party, for a social cause, with you in your ability to do something, like in Alex's example, I'm a fantastic guitarist, better than most, if not all. And then on the flip side, maybe some people that have the victim identity. I think anytime you've allowed yourself to identify with something to where maintaining the identity becomes more important than whatever reality has in store for you is a good beacon as some place that might be worth inwardly exploring with, a therapist, friends, yourself, whatever people choose to do.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Kyle. Next up is Mike Amori.
Yeah, I think I'm not sure if I can make the distinction between being in myself, we're talking about, right, in ourselves, between narcissism and the ego, how they connect. But in myself, it's right along with what Alex said. It's when you find yourself not willing to be with a group of people where you are in the bottom third. If you could rank people by their ability, if you could create some average, and you're spending not enough time at the bottom third, you're not doing it right. I mean, if you just have to be constantly, I've done it myself. I was a musician, and Alex, when you told that story, I don't have time to do it now, but I lived through that exact thing, thinking I was this terrific musician, and it just got blown away when I got out into the real world. So I just think you have to be willing to spend time in that bottom third. And if you're not, that could be a sign of your own narcissistic behavior.
Wonderful. I mean, what I'm hearing from everybody here is the importance of exposing yourself to a larger context so that you can get a realistic estimation of where we are. Next up is going to be Kevin, Mike, Mary, and Marjorie. Kevin.
Thank you, Shanka. I would say I got two comments for this. One is role play. Act like you were someone else. What you can do. The basic rule: don't do to others what you don't want to be done to you. Second one is learn though, like chapter 28 we just finished. If even you are in a high, but you like to stay in a low, be humble. Thank you.
Thank you. Mike, how do you recognize signs of narcissism within yourself? 60 seconds.
60 seconds. To paraphrase F. Lee Bailey, the person who tries to analyze oneself objectively has a fool for a therapist. Continuing along that line, we can't analyze a politician by deconstructing his campaign rhetoric. If that constituted due process, we would clear the aisles in both houses of Congress and the executive branch. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Mary, followed by Marjorie and Alex. Mary.
So to recognize narcissism in yourself, I think that it's important to be responsible for your honest memory and reflection of the interactions that you have with other people. So being mindful preemptively of the narcissistic expressions, and then in your own life, being mindful of what other people have communicated to you verbally and non-verbally, as well as how you have responded. And then with that, I think that holds each of us to the growth mindset of being honest and present communicators.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. It's going to be Marjorie, me, and then Alex. Marjorie.
Yeah, I think it's really hard, first of all, to look at yourself honestly, because I think we all can just spend a long time fooling ourselves. But often I think, those things which are the hardest things to hear about ourselves are sometimes the most important. For instance, I had a conversation with my son the other day, and I was thinking, what? When he was talking to me, and it was about me, but it was very, very important. I think, on reflection, to be open to hearing it, I think it was very important for me to be able to hear what he had to say, even though it was difficult.
Wonderful. Thank you. I think the point about confirmation bias is a huge point, that we don't tend to see our own limitations. And so the crucial thing is firstly to have a warning light. It's pay attention to things, because actually reality will be giving you feedback. Other people are giving you feedback, and you're actually ignoring it. So it's trying to pay attention a little bit more. And I think other people is crucial. Just having a context where you can honestly ask somebody who basically cares for you, and at the same time will be honest with you. I think those are extremely, extremely valuable in so many different ways, but including this one, I think. Alex.
Yeah, two quick things. I think, like what Marjorie just said, if it hurts to think about or deal with, dive in deeper. And it really, I think, fundamentally is a disorder of relationships and your connections to other people. So generally, these type of things will come up in a situation where there's some valuation of yourself relative to other people, rather than, I don't know. I would guess that most of this stuff wouldn't come up if you're walking alone in nature,
Wonderful. Is your dog jealous that you're talking to somebody else?
Yeah, he was getting upset.
Okay.
He's a narcissist.
Oh, that's wonderful. All right. Next, we're going to take the question on, this was, I think, Margarita's question. Why is there narcissism if it is bad? What is the evolutionary reason for narcissism to be there? Why is it there in the first place if it is bad? So if you would like to answer that question, go ahead and type ! Or raise your hand in Zoom. Shane Murray.
I'm imagining, and it just came to me that you could be able to pursue things which are beyond your conception of yourself. So if you have a low conception of yourself, but yet there's a narcissistic component, which isn't, I don't think, a legitimate sense of self, it allows you to go beyond your conception of yourself, which probably is very limited. So it allows you to go beyond low self-esteem, low conception of self. It allows you to aim higher than that which you believe of yourself.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shane Murray. Next up is David, followed by Charlie. David.
Yes, Shrikant. Again, there wanted to sort of make a distinction here between egoism and self-esteem versus narcissism, and whether narcissism is good. Because there's this question of why people need to have self-esteem, and we've discussed that a little bit. But why narcissism exists is more for self-preservation. I mean, again, as Alex was mentioning, this comes up a lot through childhood trauma. and through the identity, and as you, Shrikant, were mentioning, the very fragility of a young child, developing specifically with some sort of damaging parents, not necessarily narcissistic parents, but whatever is invalidating the child. And so narcissism exists, not that it's good for necessarily that person with that who develops that disorder for society as a whole, but it is necessary and quote unquote good for that person in preserving the ego, preserving the child, creating a mechanism for this child, this infant, to survive. So this is a survival defense mechanism that's created. And so in that sense, it's good in terms of the survival of the species. It's good for survival of that infant, which is different than it being good in this other question we were discussing of narcissism versus ego, I mean, or self-esteem.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Next up is going to be Charlie, Sean, Kevin, me, and Alex. Charlie.
Now, this is something I thought about quite a bit, and the question was about evolution, okay? Why, okay? And my own personal belief on this is that when people were hunter-gatherers, the sense of community was very strong. And so that antisocial personality individuals were shunned and actually thrown out of the tribe. But as we began to have agriculture, what happened was we started to have standing armies, and we started to have individuals who were in the dark triad, okay, the psychopathy, narcissism, and Machiavellianism, that became esteemed members of society because they were war heroes. They went out and murdered people, okay, for the good of the tribe. And so that I think it's really, I have no proof of this, okay, because the science of behavioral genomics is still in its infancy. But I strongly believe that this is where it came from. It came from the development of worshiping psychopaths during the onset of the agricultural societies. And anyway, that's my own take on it.
Thank you, Charlie. Next up is Sean and Kevin. Sean.
Yeah, well, one of the things I was thinking about is the actual phenomenon of narcissism is really just an interpretation we give to a set of characteristics, of course, the spectrum. So I wonder if it's even something that emerges as a phenomenon rather than just being the leftover byproduct of trauma, where, you know, when you kill off a lot of other things, that's what you're left with. Therefore, I'm not sure it even has to have an evolutionary imperative to go along with it. It's kind of like a product of damage rather than a expression of something advantageous. So anyway, I'm not a clinician, but that's just kind of what I was thinking about.
Thank you. Next up is Kevin, Mike, and Margarita. Kevin.
Yes, thank you. I got one idea on opposite right. We write dunk, maybe look for dunk. Sometimes we value self-ego and self-esteem and self-confidence. However, I didn't notice, maybe I overcross the line, you know, it's too much. So they self-narcissism on the play. And the second is obviously our culture and education play a big role. So like when we raise child, yeah, you are the best, you are good, or rather say you can do it. We say you are good. So, and also public image practice, for example, Trump style. He is a leader, he's super. I'm going to learn from him. And social media. That's also hurt. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Mike, followed by Margarita. Mike.
I think maybe it exists because some of us, or all of us to some extent, we're willing to swallow the disdain for the narcissist because we're the benefits of what it is that they produce. Whether that narcissist is heading a Hollywood studio or the chair of a department in a university or the platoon commander or running a tech company, if I am an employee in any one of those areas and I am the recipient, whether it be financial or I'm getting a paper published or I'm getting some benefit from the narcissist's production, maybe I then am willing to swallow my disdain for the narcissist in order to receive the benefit for what they produce.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. Next up is Margarita.
Yes, thank you. I give this question, but I also want to discuss, because other than the nurture, how the environment like trauma can create a narcissist, we can also take a look at the genetic, because these narcissists, they appear so convincing. They're grandiose, is appealing for us. That's the reality, especially in mating. You want to find that characteristic in your potential mate, because that is so exciting. That's why they will get more partners. And that's what happened with narcissists today. They are so good in short-term relationship. So that's why they will be able to get more mates and more children, offspring, and therefore more potential to become people with narcissists. But other than that, I think what I want to share is more about our community actually not just hate this kind of trait, but we kind of indulge in it. We like it. So that's something that we need to acknowledge, that we have this dichotomy of thinking about narcissism. But other than that, I believe it's not just about genetic, but also about how our community, our society has changed so far, the structure of family, and also more exposure to violence, divorce, and neglect to children. That's kind of putting them into more higher probability of manifesting this tendency. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Margarita. This is really, really fascinating discussion of both kind of questions, and all the answers are just amazing. Thank you. Next up is Marjorie.
Yeah, I also think we give power to narcissists in that they take away anxiety, ambiguity that we may face, because a narcissist has to think in terms of black and white, all or nothing, and they have to they appear all powerful. So it sort of recreates a child adult parent relationship, an early child parent relationship. So in some ways that's appealing, as Margarita had said, that it takes away having to feel anxious about things, or if there's ambiguity involved.
Wonderful. Thank you, Marjorie. Next up is Alex.
Yeah, I think those are all really good points. I wonder if there's a benefit to operating in the world without empathy for success. You basically are an uneven playing field. You will do things to be successful that others won't do because of the harm it will cause to others. So that may select for people like psychopaths and narcissists, people with very low empathy, who are able to be more successful and, historically be more likely to, pass their genes on. Yeah, so I wonder if that's part of it, is just, even though we're cutting out the growth mindset, I guess maybe here's a question: how long has the growth mindset been important? Right? Was there a point at which it wasn't important yet in our evolutionary? Because if before that, maybe it's beneficial to be able to just go kill someone and not worry about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just doing this wild speculation, okay? But best as I understand it, this primacy of consciousness, kind of having confidence in your own, whatever is in your own psyche, is a very old part of human beings. It is older than the conscious interiority, older than speech. You can see that in primates. It's very, very primitive. And so in that sense, I think, and the other insight I have is that it is very closely connected to the group. It is not just I, but it is my people, whether it is my family or my in-group, that is good, and everybody else is bad. This is very much of tribal thinking, which is very, very old. So I suspect this is actually a very old part of us. And taking feedback from the world, of having these feedback loops, having the growth mindset, is much later part. It presupposes a much more complex world complex civilizations, cities. It presupposes all kinds of other things. So I see it as being the older part of us. Again, that's it is a speculation, but that's what I, as best as I know. Next up is Madeline, followed by Shane Murray. Madeline.
Yes, this speaks to the somewhat evolutionary side of things. Many years ago, I had a friend who had been in the Peace Corps in a developing country, and this person was embedded in a traditional hunter-gatherer tribe. Basic things like the importance of hand washing, or we're going to build a well, just basic things. And this person told me that there were traditional hunts to initiate the young men into manhood. And when there was a boy who had clearly been a problem from the very beginning, so basically someone in the dark triad, as we would now call it, that boy would go out on the initiation hunt with the other boys and the elders and would be brought back to the group on a stretcher, having died of the wounds from the prey they were hunting, supposedly. So in other words, they couldn't afford to keep these people alive, and they knew that.
Thank you. Next up is Shane Murray.
Yes, I keep thinking of this feedback loop that you mentioned, and I'm deeply curious because it seems like nowadays the feedback loop is commonly poor. There's a lot of communication that's poor, and there's not a lot of insight to be gleaned. And so if you choose to ignore others for your own intuition or whatever it is, that might be a well-laid path. So, and it also might be viewed as narcissistic. So there are some nuances there that need to be discussed. And I don't know, and that gets really weird because a lot of times you're like, well, should I listen to myself? It's just not black and white, unfortunately. And I don't know how you tease that out. Thank you.
That's a great point, because it's not that others are automatically right. Others can be wrong too. And you can be wrong, just like you can be wrong, the others can be wrong. And so you need to have the perspective of firstly doing it over time. So you're doing this incessantly in every possible way. Hopefully some of that at some cycle, it doesn't mean that you will not make mistakes. It doesn't mean that the feedback is not going to be, that feedback is going to be always right. So it's a question of having kind of multiple sources of feedback, internal, external. So for example, writing is a very good way of doing feedback. You're putting your thoughts there and then you're looking at it at another time, something like that. You're talking to multiple people at work, people in the family, people who are friends, people who are very different from you, from each other. You're moving from context to context. You're trying to evaluate it across. So you can just make it as rich as possible. But no matter what you do, feedback can be wrong, and it doesn't guarantee that you're going to be right. So it's like eternal vigilance is the only answer to that. Charlie, you had a point about this one?
Yeah, I just want to make a quick comment. A lot of people have mentioned binary thinking and the closed mind and stuff like that. There's in the 5-factor model of personality, there's a dimension called openness to experience. And it specifically focuses on that question, that people who are very low on openness to experience are people who think in terms of black and white and so on. And that people who are narcissists are very low on openness to experience. And people who are attracted to narcissists, okay, are also very low on openness to experience. So, and it is heritable. Okay, and so there is this genetic thing that's going on. I know, of course, that the nurture is very important. Probably 70% of behavior or more can be attributed to experience, but there is, I believe, a strong genetic factor that plays itself out.
Thank you for bringing that up, Charlie. Really appreciate that. A great point. Next up, we're going to be talking about, if somebody is narcissist, what is the way out for them? What does the cure look like? What is the path to recovery look like? If you'd like to comment on that, go ahead and type exclamation mark. I'm going to give 10 seconds. Otherwise, I'm going to ask Alex. Okay, we're going to start with Shane Murray.
Okay, sorry. The thing that comes most immediately to mind to this is when we're looking for resolution for others. That feels very disconcerting to me. When we're weighing on the avenue of somebody else and the trajectory of their life, it seems to me like immediately paramount that the focus should be on self and how we find our own trajectory. We do not have the answers. Typically, most people don't have the answers on how to live their own lives well. And it seems very disconcerting to me that we give more time and credit to how somebody else should navigate their own lives when we have no clue how to navigate our own in a way that makes it most productive and useful and those kinds of things. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane Marie. I mean, the question is basically that if a person is in this position, whether it is you or somebody else, where you have a wrong conception of your own value, what is the path for them, regardless of whether it is you or another? So what's the general solution? I don't think we're talking about that, oh, others are in this position, I'm not. It's a question of if a person is in that position, what are the ways out? Next up is going to be Charlie.
Yeah, actually, I've read a bit about this, and there's two things, okay? One is that the narcissist is very unlikely to seek psychotherapy, okay? And if a narcissist does seek psychotherapy, that what is needed for success is an unusually competent psychotherapist, because it is so easy to push the wrong button and then the narcissist is gone. And so first of all, the narcissist has to want to have psychotherapy, which is unlikely. And the next thing is that the therapist has to be damn competent on how to deal with that, okay? So anyway, that's that.
That's a great point. Actually, Brian McVeigh makes that point all the time, that he says that when person actually comes and shows up for therapy, that itself is like half the battle, because they are saying that there is a problem and I want to deal with it. Once you've done that, actually you're halfway there. Then it's only details, but most people don't get there, either of those two. Next up is going to be Madeline, followed by Margarita. Madeline.
Yes, Shrikant, you seemed to be asking two different questions, and I just wanted to ask everyone to clarify as they answer. One was about how we deal with narcissistic traits in ourselves or with others. And the other one seemed to be what to do when you encounter someone who you believe has genuine narcissistic personality disorder.
We're not talking about others. The question is only like if a person has a narcissist tendencies or is a narcissist, how do they cure themselves? What course do they take?
This would be someone with narcissistic tendencies or NPD?
You can answer for both if you want. Go ahead. Okay, next up is Margarita.
Yes, hi. So personality is a collection of thought, feeling, behavior that's quite permanent, and it has been developed across time. Actually, we can only start diagnosing personality disorder after age 18, so it means already settled. So that means changing your personality. Probably it's very difficult, especially narcissism. Therapies usually know that this is going to be a difficult case. However, we can try to adjust our behavior into more adaptive. So what I mean is maybe we just focus on the problem, the behavior that we need to change. For example, just focus on small things. We don't change the whole person. For example, usually people with personality disorder come because they have problems with their relationship. For example, they want to get divorced. So what is the behavior that is the root of this problem? Then we try to solve it by making reference of this wrongful ideas or cognitive distortion that is happening in one's mind. We target it, but we will need some kind of professional support for that. I don't think we can do it by ourselves if we have that tendency. Yeah, that's
wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Margarita. Next up is David.
Yeah, Shrikant, I wanted to reinforce what a lot of people have been saying about the ability to change, and also the ability to recognize. I mean, a lot of the core issue with any of these personality disorders is something called ego syntonic versus ego dystonic. And so the issue is that with narcissists and many other personality disorders, this is fundamental to their personality in the sense that they and their ego and their self agrees with their behavior. They don't recognize it as a problem. And as we've been saying with many other problems, whether it's alcoholism, anything else, I mean, the first is, to admit that one has a problem, to admit that one is not, and that's ego dystonic, that one dislikes their behavior, one sees the negative impact on themselves and on others, and therefore is willing to approach a therapist or friends or pastor or somebody to try to change their behavior and to try to get this feedback. So the problem is, as we're saying, that most narcissists, people who have narcissistic personality disorder at the extreme end, are believe that their behavior is correct, is justified, is successful for them, and therefore they are not eager, willing to seek out any sort of change or treatment, even if they're, other people, friends will say this is damaging to them. I mean, it's mainly the narcissist saying, well, I'm right and you're wrong, and let's come here and how can we fix you to make you, I mean, in this sort of flippant way, how can we make you better supply for me or fix this problem with supply, but really how can we make you function better in my world because my world's correct. And it's very difficult to get these people to change unless, as we're saying, Alex and others and Marguerite, they're willing to accept that there is a problem and want to change themselves. So that's with any personality. Again, as Marguerite is saying, this is locked in very early on, and any, not even a disorder, I mean, any characteristic we have, it has to be that we want to change for some motivation we have, not that some friend, not somebody else, drags us along or says, or a girlfriend, I'm going to fix you. That's not going to produce any change.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much, David. Next up is Alex.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add to this one, but philosophically, I think thinking about it as a cure, like finding a cure for it, might not be like that. I feel like in its own is almost a black and white type of thinking. Like what Margarita said, like altering behavior and changing people's ways that they interact in the world could be, not just, could be progressive and not all the way back to square one and rebuilding as a person, right? So, yeah, I would just echo, if they end up actually believing that they want to change, that's the most important thing.
Wonderful. Now we're going to take 3 last questions. 2 of them are very small, and one of them, the final one, is larger. The 2 of them are going to be, first one is Mike asked a very interesting question. Wanting to be a big fish in a small pond, is that connected to being a narcissist? That's the first question we're going to do. Then we're going to talk about, does social media encourage narcissism and what to do about it? And last, we're going to end up with the intergenerational nature of narcissism. So the question, big fish in a small pond, is that an indication? Is that wanting to be a narcissist? Any thoughts on that? Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to comment on that. Okay, Margarita.
Hi, Shrikant. I think because this is a personality disorder, it's not just on particular environment that this this trait come up, but it's everywhere. So it's not just a small fish in small pond, probably even in other areas, not just in a work setting, intimate relationship, and many things that will occur.
Thank you. Shane Murray.
I was just thinking, if you desire to be a big fish in a small pond, there's probably an issue. But if you desire to be a big fish in a big pond with lots of other big fish, then you're okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Alex, what do you think?
Speaking from my own experience, that aspect of the music stuff was definitely the one area that I really wanted to stay in the small pond, right? It subconsciously, just avoiding. So I would say yes, in terms of if you're talking about a specific like dimension of your personality in one aspect, like with that, it was for me. And yeah, but like was said, if having to do with relationships, I think it's a lot bigger than that, for sure.
Thank you. I think this is a very interesting point, because I think just relentlessly expanding the scope of what you're trying to do and putting yourself into very different, varied contexts, which you're not familiar with, which you're not skilled at, is something, a great way of kind of seeing your limits. And the limits will become very apparent to you. Because what happens is that you kind of get used to that little pond and you know everything about it. When you go to the big pond, there is so much more. So I think it's a great way of keeping the feedback going to it. Because the thing is that even the confirmation bias is very real, and you don't want to fall into that trap. So I think this is a very easy way of kind of keeping on going to big ponds. See where you are in that. Next up is going to be Marjorie.
Yeah, I think it depends upon context too. So can you say that, like Mother Teresa, there was a narcissistic component to her helping, her community? Maybe, but what was so bad about that? I think that having a narcissistic component to wanting to stand out because you want to help others or reach out is not necessarily a bad thing. If you're doing it for reasons of exploiting other people or to dominate or to manipulate, I think then, that's a different story.
Thank you. Thank you. I come from India. Calcutta is a very big pond, and the misery there is so large. And what Mother Teresa was able to do was a very small part of that. And I'm sure she was aware of that, of just the limitations of what she had. So absolutely, you can't but be aware of your limitations when you're trying to do something in that larger context. Thank you. I'm going to call on, I really would like to hear from Dr. Sheila about how she thinks about narcissism. So, Dr. Sheila, please take your time. Just tell, would really appreciate it if you tell us what you think of narcissism.
Well, I think of it in terms of it denying cooperation, usually. I mean, the key element of it that I think most people are stuck on is that it requires that you not cooperate, but that you compete. And ultimately, idealists everywhere think that's a bad idea. The sociologists critique our culture in America all the time. The sickest part of our culture is believing that if you win, I lose. The zero-sum game mentality, which I run into all the time. I'm a therapist. I run into it all the time. And when somebody says, oh, my sister just got into Harvard and I want to die, in response to that, I say, but that's she's part of your pod. You're a lucky kid. Like, that's great. That's perfect. That's wonderful. And the person will want to, harbor contempt and all kinds of feelings of inadequacy and jealousy and you name it, all kinds of negativity around the event of their successful sibling. And I get this, whether it's a successful sibling or a lover or kid or any other successes in the sphere of the individual, they'll be upset by it instead of thinking, yay, this is us, which is what I want to encourage, which is apparently very un-American to say, you know, my people have succeeded is not really a very American thought. Instead, in America, typically people are saying, if you did that, I should do it too. If you succeeded in a particular way or distinguish yourself as you have, I should be able to do it too. And some nasty person is the reason why I didn't. And it's a bad thing. So I think that the narcissism that I see all the time is this inability to take pleasure in someone else's success. And so if you are the big fish in a little pond and you like it that way, you unfortunately, you probably like it because if I'm big, you're little. And that's a pretty crummy version of reality. Not very pleasant and just not very nice at all. I'd much prefer people to say, wow, you're big and I get to be with you. And that's like, this is all good. I'm witnessing the bigness of it all. That's, you know, I much prefer that. But so mostly when I get to see someone asking, what can I do about how bad I feel? That's a really good thing. When narcissistic people or traits come into the room and they say, I feel so bad about this, that's wonderful. I mean, you don't even expect to see it. And I get it constantly, and thank God. Like, I guess that's a living, right? But it's a kind of, it's a little depressing because if I'm overly empathetic, you know, that's terrible. But on the other hand, it's the avenue for the opportunity is so great in turning around their thinking that it's, you know, low-hanging fruit. It's great.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Sheila. Appreciate that. All right, I think we have run quite a bit over time, so I'm going to give Alex an opportunity of making any kind of closing remarks that you want. Alex, go ahead.
I just want to thank everybody for all their input. I think that was really insightful from everybody, and I definitely learned a lot. So it's a huge topic, and I'm glad that everybody was here to kind of start to you know, become aware of some generalities about it. And then if you're interested, there's lots of great resources and lots of people who specialize in different aspects that I think can you know, like some of the people we have here that have a really good grasp on the kind of steps if you know, are in a relationship with somebody, have a relationship with somebody who is a narcissist and are ongoing, you know, enduring emotional abuse or dealing with stuff from your past or anything. I think from what I've seen from people close to me and, you know, within myself, like it's the therapeutic route is extremely helpful. So
thank you, Alex. Alex, would you, if you have some resources, could you put them in the comment section of the Meetup page so people can look them up?
Sure.
Thank you. Alex, again, this was a tremendous pleasure. I thought I think this is a very important topic, and we broached the topic. We had everybody thinking about it. You know, it's enormously complex. You're not going to solve too many problems, but being aware of the problems is the first step, both within ourselves, within people around us, and within society. Knowing that there is a problem is the first step. So I think that we did at least that much, which is quite impressive. So thank you very much. Really appreciate that. All right, folks. I just want to tell you that I have an incredible series starting up next Sunday. The Center for the Study of Digital Life has agreed to do an 8-part series with us. It's going to be history of civilization and what is wrong with our world. It's going to look at the East, what is happening to the East, what is happening to China, India, Japan. It's going to look at the West. It's going to start with the disenchantment of the West and a way forward. We are going to talk about the digital sphere and how the digital sphere, the internet and technology is changing all cultures. How is it changing the East? How is it changing the West? and what is it likely to end up as. So it is a really it's the best content that I have ever even imagined that we could put together. So I've gotten kind of previews of the lectures. They are simply stunning. Okay, so don't miss that. I'm going to have limited seats available. I'm going to send out an email shortly about it, but just look up. It's October 3rd is the first one. And then it is every October 3rd at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So don't miss it. It's going to be really, really special. All right. So thank you very much, everybody. Tomorrow we are looking at the poem If. I hope you can join us. Good night.